In the spring of 1941, long before Pearl Harbor ever echoed across American radios, there was a secret little drama unfolding inside the smoke-filled war rooms of Tokyo, where Imperial Japanese admirals sat around polished tables, pretending they were playing chess, but acting more like Vegas gamblers trying to rig the roulette wheel. And brother, they were convinced they were about to pull off the slickest hit and run in naval history. See, Japan's Navy had this tradition of running massive war games every year. Tabletops covered in tiny ships, maps the size of living room carpets, commanders shouting, "Move the carrier group 3 hexes east," like some anime-level Monopoly match. And this time, they were rehearsing their big, wild, history-changing plan, the surprise attack that would cripple the American Pacific Fleet and scare Uncle Sam into backing off the whole Pacific thing. But here's the crazy part that nobody outside hardcore WW2 nerd circles ever talks about. The war game said Japan would lose. Straight up, no sugarcoating. And instead of listening, instead of stepping back and saying, "Hey, maybe this plan ain't as bulletproof as we think," Japan's top brass basically shrugged like teenagers caught skipping homework, flipped the dice back onto the table and went, "Nah, run that again, but this time make it look like we win." So the referees, yeah, they actually had referees, had to re-roll outcomes, change rules mid-game, resurrect sunken carriers, and basically baby-proof the entire simulation just to make the admirals feel good about themselves. And the dude at the center of all this, Admiral Yamamoto, brilliant but stubborn as a locked Ford pickup, was trying to engineer a knockout punch on America so clean he believed Washington would sit down at the table and negotiate peace. But deep down, even he knew the war games were screaming red flags, because the moment Japan pushed deeper into the Pacific in the simulation, this imaginary American counterattack showed up like a tidal wave, crushing the Japanese fleet exactly the way the dice predicted. Yet every time the Japanese players lost, the referees just reset the board, brought the ships back magically, and forced a win scenario. And man, that arrogance, that blind faith in their own hype, that's what set the stage for the most ironic twist in WW2 naval history. Because a year later, at Midway, the real-life battle played out almost step for step the same way the original, unrigged war game predicted, right down to the carriers being caught refueling planes at the worst moment possible, proving the dice had been telling the truth all along, and Japan had just ignored their own prophecy. So while the admirals were patting themselves on the back like they'd just solved world peace, the officers actually running the game, the mid-level guys, the analysts, the number crunchers who understood logistics better than anybody in the room, were looking at each other like, "Brah, this is straight-up delusion." Because in the real, untempered version of the simulation, the Japanese strike force didn't glide across the Pacific like some unstoppable anime fleet. No, man, they ran headfirst into a brick wall of American industrial might. And the craziest moment of that whole war game came when one young operations officer, who was bold enough to speak his mind in a room full of big egos, declared that Japan's prized carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiruyu, would get wiped out by U.S. dive bombers if they ever got caught mid-rearm during the midway phase of the exercise. And when he said that, the entire room turned on him like he'd just insulted their mothers. Because admitting that their invincible carriers could be sunk was like telling a cowboy his horse can't outrun a bicycle. And the referees immediately reversed the outcome, claiming the attack shouldn't count because the American planes were too lucky, which is wild because luck is literally half of naval warfare. But pride was pride, and Japan wasn't about to run a simulation that made them look fragile. And what's insane is that even after the referees brought the sunken carriers back to life, like some naval Jesus event, the rest of the game kept showing the same pattern. Japan pushed too far, split its forces too thin, and America, with its absurd production line and radar tech, kept smacking back. Yet the admirals still refused to adjust the plan, still clung to this fantasy that America would negotiate after a single punch, ignoring their own experts, their own numbers, even their own simulated losses. And by the time the war game ended, the only thing Japan had really won was the award for most ignored warning signs in military history. Because everything they overrode, every sunk ship they revived, every rule they bent to save face, every "nah, that doesn't count" moment would come back to haunt them when the real shooting started. And imagine being that officer who predicted all of it, watching the battle unfold a year later exactly like his simulation said, knowing that if the admirals had listened, if they had swallowed their pride just once, the entire Pacific War might have gone down differently. But instead, Japan walked into Midway thinking they were unstoppable, while America walked in pissed off, resource-heavy, and ready to swing, just like the dice warned.
Now here's where the story gets even wilder. Because after the war game wrapped up and everyone pretended Japan won, the senior commanders carried that fake confidence straight into their planning rooms like a bunch of guys who practiced basketball with the hoop lowered to 6 feet and then thought they were ready for the NBA. And Admiral Nagumo, who would later lead the actual carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, walked around with this boosted ego like the war game proved he was some kind of naval genius, even though the only reason his fleet survived in the simulation was because the referees literally rewrote the rules mid-match to keep him alive. But the officers who saw behind the curtain, the ones who watched the referees bend fate like a cheap paperclip, they knew the truth. Japan's entire strategy was sitting on a foundation as flimsy as a card table in a hurricane. And the real kicker was how the war game foresaw the exact Achilles heel that would doom Japan at Midway: split forces, delayed communications, overconfidence, and that fatal timing overlap where Japanese carriers were caught with their decks cluttered with fuel hoses and bomb carts, which the young officer had pointed out during the simulation, only to be shut down by senior brass who didn't want their heroes embarrassed on a tabletop. And when historians dig through the transcripts today, you can actually see the tension. Junior officers trying to politely say, "Sir, respectfully, this isn't gonna work," and senior officers basically going, "Shut up, kid, we're Japan, we don't lose," and you just want to grab them by the shoulders and shake them, because the simulation wasn't subtle, it wasn't hinting or whispering, it was yelling, "Do not fight this war like this." But cultural pride, rigid hierarchy, and the refusal to admit human vulnerability drowned out every warning. And that arrogance didn't just shape the strategy, it shaped the mindset, the training, the propaganda, the expectations of every sailor who stepped aboard those carriers. Which is tragic, because most of those men had absolutely no clue that the brass had seen the future and then ignored it, marching them straight toward a fate that the dice predicted with freakish accuracy, all because the Navy didn't want to lose a pretend game on a damn conference table. And so, with the stage set, Japan steamed toward Pearl Harbor and later Midway with confidence pumped full of artificial air, not realizing their entire war plan was basically a rigged lottery ticket with the wrong numbers printed on it.
By the time Pearl Harbor rolled around, Japan was riding that high like a guy who hit one lucky jackpot in Vegas and suddenly thinks he's a math genius. And the crazy part is that the attack itself, yeah, it was tactically impressive, bold, cinematic, all that. But strategically, it was the exact kind of overreach the wargame had already warned them about. Because while the admirals cheered the burning battleships and patted themselves on the back for landing a decisive blow, they completely ignored the fact that the American carriers weren't even in the harbor, meaning the punch they threw didn't land where it mattered. But Japan didn't want to hear that, man. They were too busy believing their own hype, treating December 7th like a permanent victory stamp, when in reality it was just the opening bell, and the referees in that long-forgotten simulation had already shown what happened after the bell. America got up, wiped the blood from its lip, and came back swinging 10 times harder. And right after Pearl Harbor, while U.S. factories were waking up like giants, Japan doubled down on the same flawed assumptions, misjudging American resolve, splitting their forces across half the Pacific, overstretching supply lines, and betting everything on speed and spirit instead of numbers and logistics. You know, classic recipe for disaster. And the irony is, the Japanese Navy kept returning to their wargame notes as if they'd been gospel, even though the version they were referencing was the rigged one, not the real one that predicted catastrophe. And the deeper Japan pushed toward Midway, the more reality started to line up with that suppressed simulation. American cryptographers cracking codes, radar spotting incoming raids, carriers coordinating strikes with efficiency Japan hadn't accounted for. And meanwhile, the Japanese command structure was becoming this tangled mess where nobody wanted to challenge the higher-ups, nobody wanted to admit the plan had blind spots, and nobody wanted to even whisper the words, "We should reconsider." Because doing that in Imperial Japan's Navy was basically career suicide. So they marched on, confident, polished, perfectly rehearsed, just the way the rigged wargame told them they would, completely unaware that every mile they sailed brought them closer to the exact scenario the dice had predicted, the moment where fate, timing, luck, and American firepower would converge in a way so eerily similar to the unaltered simulation that even the surviving officers later said it felt like they were watching a prophecy unfold in real time.
And as the calendar flipped to June 1942, with the Pacific sun beating down on wide-open ocean, and every sailor on every deck sweating through the tension, Japan's entire Midway operation was already wobbling like a bar stool with one leg shorter than the others. Because the truth their war game had practically screamed was that their plan relied on perfect timing, perfect weather, perfect intelligence, and a perfectly clueless enemy. And, brother, the Americans were anything but clueless by then. Thanks to the code breakers at Station Hypo, Nimitz already knew the Japanese were coming, knew the target, knew the timetable, and positioned his carriers in a spot that Japan never even considered, which was exactly the kind of unpredictable American curveball the original simulation tried to warn them about. But hey, pride makes people blind, and Japanese commanders sailed toward Midway like actors hitting marks on a script they thought they wrote, not realizing the U.S. Navy was already backstage rewriting the whole damn play.
And the moment the Japanese scout planes failed to spot the American carriers, again, exactly as predicted in the war game, the clock started ticking toward disaster. Because Nagumo, following rigid doctrine, kept juggling two completely different strike packages at once. One set of planes loaded with torpedoes for ship attacks, the other set armed for bombing the island. And just like the simulation foretold, he flip-flopped at the worst possible moment, ordering the rearming process to switch midstream, which meant Japanese flight decks were soon cluttered with live bombs, leaking fuel hoses, torpedoes lying around unsecured. Basically, the floating equivalent of juggling chainsaws near a campfire. But because the rigged war game had dismissed this vulnerability as unrealistic, nobody in the Japanese high command ever rehearsed how to handle it when the real danger arrived. And when the American scout planes finally caught sight of the fleet, sending urgent contacts back to Spruance and McCluskey, the Japanese were still stuck in that deadly in-between state the simulation had flagged as catastrophic, but which the referees had erased because it made the admirals look bad. And as the U.S. dive bombers climbed into position high above the clouds, unseen and unchallenged, ready to rewrite history in fire and steel, the Japanese Navy was about to learn, hard and fast, that you can rig a game on a table, but you can't rig the ocean, and you sure as hell can't rig a war.
And then came the moment. The world-tilting, fate-snapping, history-rearranging moment when the American dive bombers broke through the clouds over Nagumo's fleet, falling like silent angels of doom with the sun at their backs. And man, if you froze the frame right there, you'd see the exact picture that the original unrigged war game had predicted. Japanese carriers wide open, decks cluttered with fully fueled planes, bombs stacked like cordwood, sailors running around trying to rearm aircraft that were halfway switched from one mission to another, and absolutely zero fighter cover at the proper altitude because the Zeros had been pulled too low chasing the earlier torpedo squadrons, which was, again, precisely the vulnerability the officers had warned about in the simulation. The same vulnerability the referees erased because the admirals didn't want to look foolish on paper. But in the real world, the dice didn't care about pride. And when Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers rolled over into their near-vertical descents, it was like the Pacific itself held its breath, because in less than 5 minutes, the whole balance of the war shifted. Bomb after bomb slammed into the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, turning them into roaring infernos so violent even Japanese survivors later said it felt as if the sea was on fire. And the craziest, most gut-punching part is that nearly every failure in that chain, every delay, every miscommunication, every bad bit of timing mirrored the war game almost beat for beat. Meaning Japan wasn't just losing a battle, they were living out the prophecy they'd tried so hard to erase. And as the smoke roared skyward and the carriers began listing, officers who'd been silenced during the war game later said they felt this eerie déjà vu wash over them, like they were watching the ghosts of their own ignored warnings rise out of the flames. Because once those carriers were hit, there was no coming back. No reset button, no referee to say that doesn't count, no magical do-over like the tabletop game. They were watching the heart of the Imperial Navy crumble in real time, and with it, Japan's entire dream of controlling the Pacific.
And while a single surviving carrier, the Hiryu, tried desperately to strike back later that afternoon, even she couldn't escape the destiny the simulation predicted, eventually falling to the same American pressure, the same dive bombers, the same exact fate the dice laid out a year earlier, proving once and for all that reality doesn't bend just because the High Command wants a prettier story. In the smoking aftermath of Midway, when the Pacific was still littered with burning oil slicks and drifting debris, the surviving Japanese officers, shell-shocked, exhausted, and carrying the weight of an empire's hopes on their shoulders, finally had to face the truth they'd avoided for over a year. The war game had been right. The officers who spoke up had been right. And the dice that predicted disaster weren't mocking them. They were warning them. And back in Tokyo, when the news hit the High Command, the entire facade of invincibility cracked like thin ice under a truck. Because Japan hadn't just lost 4 frontline carriers, they'd lost the initiative, the momentum, and the elite air crews they could never replace. While America, fueled by a manufacturing engine bigger than anything Japan could dream of, was just gearing up for the long haul, ready to crank out carriers, planes, and pilots faster than Japan could draw breath. And as reports trickled in, some officers openly admitted they remembered the exact moves, the exact timing, the exact catastrophic sequence from the original simulation down to the minute, and they finally whispered what no one dared say before. We ignored our own prophecy. Because Midway wasn't some fluke of luck. It was the physical manifestation of every warning Japan had erased, every truth they'd buried under pride, and every hard lesson they refused to learn. And historians today still shake their heads at the irony. Japan rigged its own war game to protect egos, only to lose the real war in the exact same way the game predicted, proving once again that you can silence your analysts, you can rewrite a script, you can bend the rules in a simulation, but reality always fights back, and in the Pacific, it fought back with a vengeance that changed history. And hey guys, if you made it all the way through this wild story of pride, prophecy, and one of the biggest we should have listened moments in World War II, then damn, you're my kind of people. I hope you enjoyed the ride. If you love deep cinematic storytelling like this, packed with twists history tried to hide, then smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss the next crazy chapter from the past. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, there's a lot more where this came from. Thanks for watching, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.